Hi, folks. Welcome to another week of Queer Genders, Drag Cultures from Riots to RuPaul. So this week we're going to be looking at particular drag scenes. And so we're going to be looking at scenes between 1969, about after the Stonewall riots, until 2009, and a few contemporary examples in particular major cities. So the plan for the lecture today is to look at some academic interpretations of drag cultures, specifically through some of your readings, particularly the Munoz reading, looking a little bit more at the historical impact of HIV/AIDS crisis, and looking at drag scenes in New York, LA, and then in Vancouver. And so for next week, which is after reading week, we'll be diving headfirst into Paris is Burning and learning about the New York underground ballroom scene and voguing culture. And for Friday, we're going to be looking at the readings, doing a close look at the readings, and also doing a check-in about your creative projects. So I'll set aside time for each group to check in with me over Zoom about some of your ideas, and then I can give you feedback individually. So these were the readings for this week, and they each explored different examples of drag scenes, giving us a little bit more in-depth historical background to drag cultures as they come out of specific historical and geographical contexts. So again, we're going to be pulling from the Boyd reading, which looks at the history of queer San Francisco to 1965. So it's a very much a pre-Stonewall look at different drag cultures. So this is going to be looking at lesbian space, lesbian territory in San Francisco's North Beach area, which talks a little bit about the kind of gender bending performances and male impersonation drag scenes that came out of this particular culture. And one of the specific focuses for today is going to be the Munoz reading, The White to Be Angry, Vaginal Cream Davis's Terrorist Drag. So this is an example of drag that we haven't really explored yet in the class that is explicitly political. It is very much anti-normativity. It is not a form of drag we see very often, and it's not a form of drag we will see on Drag Race. And it comes from a lot of queercore punk scenes. So I hope you've enjoyed that reading. It's definitely one of my favorite books about drag. So we'll talk about that later. So academic studies of drag cultures, or what we can call drag studies, largely explore the meaning of drag performance in cultural and historical context. So what I mean by that is it's not just looking at drag in a contemporary lens, but trying to think about what drag performance, and drag performers mean in a specific place in a specific time. So trying to think about what a specific drag performance does in a different scene. So what does it look like? What kinds of community memory is it mobilizing? And by that I mean, is it speaking to a specific political culture? Is it coming from a history of things like sex work? Is it couched in a form of politics? Or is it just kind of played out as a form of more fun performance? So all kinds of drag do different things. So we're kind of coming back to thinking about not what drag is, but what it does. So we can maybe ask, what are the factors that might inform whether drag is something that is subversive? So is it challenging kind of normative notions of gender, of race, of class? Is it pushing back against norms, or is it normative? And then maybe we can even break down when we say something is normative. Is a female impersonator, if we're going to use that language, just trying to kind of pass as a woman? Or is even dressing in what we might see as binary and normative drag itself a form of political subversion? And so again, drag studies really takes into account how things like gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, and nationality inform drag studies. So thinking about the latter two, ability and nationality, this is kind of a newer critique that's been brought in. So we might not think about drag in terms of the nation, but later when we look at Drag Race closely, we'll kind of explore the ways that drag mobilizes, drag in the context of Drag Race through RuPaul uses the idea of America or as the nation to talk about drag as being part of kind of normative culture. So again, what do different forms of drag do? How are they perceived? So in this, we're kind of trying to account for how the audience of a particular show in the past and in the present, how did they shape the legibility of drag performance? So we can kind of start thinking of a drag show as an interplay between the performers and the people watching. And how has that shifted over time as drag has become more normative, as opposed to a time when drag has been historically, for the most part, as kind of an underground queer and trans kind of cultural space. So, how has that changed? We'll be engaging a little bit with Munoz's idea of disidentification as a reading practice. So, this is something that we can kind of take in our own readings of drag, thinking about the ways that certain drag performers, and in this case, Vaginal Cream Davis, who we'll talk about in a bit, um, uses tropes of white masculinity, of white supremacy in her drag to critique those very systems. And again, thinking about drag as a subversive or transgressive, and then how can we kind of move in between some of the logic of, is it normative or is it transgressive? And maybe it's not a static thing. Maybe that binary logic isn't as useful as we think it is. So and then, of course, we are going to be preparing to talk about Paris is Burning for week 6, which comes after reading week. Thinking about the way that the theory of performativity through the work of Judith Butler, as we've talked about a few times, is really enacted, or we can read it as enacted through Paris is Burning. So just kind of moving back a few steps to again consider some of the historical context that is informing and shaping drag cultures and LGBTQ communities broadly in the 1980s and 90s. So a lot of the drag cultures we have explored already are happening during this time period. And particularly for today, when we look at things like Wigstock, when we look at kind of the punk scenes in LA that Vaginal Cream Davis is working in, and then we look at club kid culture in the late 80s, early 90s, these are all happening in the context of this huge crisis of which was a global pandemic, but specifically the way it's being played out in LGBTQ communities, how it's impacting the community. And so we can't talk about drag cultures in those historical moments without talking about the impact that HIV/AIDS had on queer and trans people. So it wasn't until the early 1980s that we started to see the first cases being recognized by the medical establishment of what we would now call HIV/AIDS. But in the beginning, when there wasn't a term for it, it was explicitly associated by the medical establishment with gay men. And so was before it was given the moniker HIV/AIDS, was called gay-related immune deficiency syndrome. So the medical establishment explicitly connecting it to particularly the so-called lifestyles of gay men and also of intravenous drug users. So there's this, before the fact, this pathologizing of queerness, of queer sex. And we still see the lingering legacy of that pathologizing today. So this crisis profoundly changed queer sexual cultures and spaces. In the 70s and even coming from the late 60s, when we see a lot of hippie countercultures, we see these kind of conversations about free love, about relaxing sexual mores. So this wasn't just in straight hippie countercultures. This was also really impactful in queer scenes where this kind of embrace of queer sex in queer scenes, of there was still the instances of cruising spaces, We've talked a lot about how certain public spaces mean something different during the day when they're maybe inhabited by kind of what we might see as more mainstream public culture, but then maybe at night become spaces for queer people, particularly gay men, to find romantic or sexual partners. And so a lot of, instances of unprotected sex, of, sex with multiple people, and this kind of freedom to do so as these queer scenes, particularly in the 70s and going into the 80s, were really expanding. And so not only did the AIDS crisis profoundly change LGBTQ scenes internally, the larger mainstream view of gay people became um, extremely negative and hostile. So it's not like there was this very friendly culture for queer people in the 1970s, but as we've talked about, the impact of gay liberation really started to shift the kinds of resources and the kinds of social mobility that gay people had. But we do see a lot of dialing back of that with the advent of AIDS. And then also the way that certain governments, the governments of Canada and the U.S., particularly the presidential administration of Ronald Reagan, was very much a part of perpetuating and continuing the impact of HIV/AIDS through kind of inaction. And so we talked about last week. I looked a little bit at ACT UP, so these forms of queer radical groups that formed in the late 80s to protest the inaction and the pathologizing of gay people, the inaction that was causing thousands of people to die. And without any sort of medical intervention, people were dying very quickly. So using things like civil disobedience, we looked at die-ins, so taking up public space, using very public language, so going to the White House and throwing ashes of their recently deceased friends, staging die-ins where people would have the names of their friends who had died of HIV/AIDS emblazoned on their shirts, and creating these kinds of large scale mock funerals and mock graveyards to really bring the impact to a public stage, utilizing the media gaze to protest the inaction, but also to talk back to this pathologizing of gay bodies. So in this time, we of course see this increase in homophobia as well as transphobia, but specifically this this homophobia towards gay men, towards gay sex, particularly towards people of color. So this increase in police violence, and also the experience of mass abandonment. So before there was kind of a knowledge of how HIV/AIDS was transmitted, there was this kind of panic around any sort of association with people with HIV/AIDS. So a lot of families would not support or even come to visit their children who were dying of AIDS in hospitals. You had many bodies that weren't collected by families. Just this kind of mass abandonment of people who were dying and dying and very quickly and en masse. So when we look at queer generations, we see this huge generational loss. So there's this large group of queer people, not just gay men. Trans folks are definitely at a higher risk of not only being not treated for things like HIV/AIDS, but it's good to point out that it wasn't just gay men being impacted, although that was kind of the media attention. So it impacted many people in the queer and trans community. But we do see this loss of so many artists, writers, people's families being completely decimated. And occasionally on Drag Race, we will see some queens who are older talk about the impact of HIV/AIDS on queer community, on drag cultures, and just people losing dozens of their friends. So although this is, a very, very heartbreaking part of queer history, it is impossible to talk about the ways that drag cultures were shifting and changing in the 80s and the 90s and even now without thinking about this impact of this global pandemic on queer community.